Chapter 1. Before he was known as Gandalf, before he walked the roads of Middle-earth clothed in grey and bearing the weariness of long vigilance, he was Olórin, a Maya whose nature was defined not by authority or force, but by patience, empathy, and restraint, and among the spirits that entered the world at its beginning, Olórin was distinguished not by prominence but by quiet influence, dwelling often in the presence of the Valar, yet speaking little, observing more than acting, and learning through listening rather than command. And it is within this early existence that the foundation of Gandalf's later wisdom must be understood, because Olórin's strength was never rooted in domination or brilliance, but in the capacity to perceive fear, sorrow, and doubt within others, and to respond not by erasing these emotions, but by helping them endure. And Tolkien describes Olórin as one who walked unseen among the children of Ilúvatar, bringing visions of hope and stirring courage in moments of despair, a role that reveals an essential aspect of his character, that he did not seek to shape the world through design or power, but through influence so subtle it often went unrecognized even by those it aided. And this invisibility was not a limitation, but a deliberate orientation, because Olórin understood that imposed solutions, however efficient, often weaken those who receive them, while encouragement preserves freedom and strengthens resolve. And among the Maiar he was counted as wise, yet his wisdom was inseparable from humility, for he feared the misuse of power and distrusted his own capacity to wield authority without diminishing others, a fear that would later define his reluctance to accept responsibility beyond counsel. And in this early phase of his existence, Olórin was closely associated with Nienna, whose domain encompassed sorrow, endurance, and compassion, and from her he learned that grief is not a flaw to be corrected, but a condition to be borne, that suffering cannot be erased by will alone, and that the attempt to dominate pain often leads to cruelty rather than healing. And this association profoundly shaped Olórin's worldview, instilling in him the belief that strength without mercy is hollow, and that true resilience arises not from the absence of fear but from the ability to act despite it. And this belief placed him in quiet opposition to other Maiar whose talents inclined them toward mastery, order, or control, because while they sought to refine the world through structure and command, Olórin sought to preserve its moral freedom, trusting that growth imposed from without would ultimately fail. And this distinction becomes critical when considering why Olórin would later succeed where others fell, because his resistance to domination was not reactive but foundational, rooted in an understanding formed long before conflict demanded its application. And even as Morgoth corrupted the world and drew many lesser spirits into his service through promises of power or purpose, Olórin remained apart not through force of will alone, but through an internal refusal to accept any vision of order that required the surrender of freedom. And this refusal was not dramatic or confrontational, but steady and absolute. And as ages passed and the struggle between light and shadow intensified, Olórin's role remained consistent, moving unseen, offering counsel without compulsion, reinforcing courage without demanding loyalty. And through this continuity the seeds of Gandalf's later identity were sown, because when the time came for the Valar to send emissaries to Middle-earth, the choice of Olórin was not based on his capacity to confront evil directly, but on his understanding of its limits, his awareness that evil thrives where fear and despair isolate individuals, and that its defeat requires not superior force, but the preservation of moral choice. And thus, before Gandalf ever bore a name, before he became a figure of legend among elves and men, Olórin existed as a reminder that wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge or authority, but the discipline to refrain from using power when its use would diminish the very freedom it seeks to protect. And this discipline, formed in silence and humility before the shaping of Middle-earth, would define every step he later took upon its soil, ensuring that when he finally entered the world as a guide rather than a ruler, his greatest strength would remain what it had always been, the refusal to dominate even when domination appeared to offer the fastest path to victory. Chapter 2, The Choice of the Istari, marks a decisive moment in the history of Middle-earth, not because it introduces new powers into the world, but because it represents a deliberate renunciation of direct intervention by those who possess the greatest authority to act. And within this decision, Olórin's role is defined as much by hesitation as by acceptance, for when the Valar resolved that emissaries should be sent to oppose the growing shadow of Sauron, their intention was not to repeat the errors of earlier ages, when force had reshaped the world at catastrophic cost, but to influence events through guidance rather than domination, and this intention imposed strict limitations on those chosen, who would take the form of old men, subject to weariness, doubt, and fear, forbidden from revealing their true nature or ruling through open power. And among those proposed for this task, Olórin stood apart, not because he was eager, but because he was reluctant, for he feared Sauron, and doubted his own ability to confront such a will without succumbing to despair or pride. And this fear, far from disqualifying him, revealed precisely why he was suited to the role, because it demonstrated an awareness of the corrupting influence of power and a respect for the danger inherent in confronting it. And when Olórin expressed his reluctance, it was not born of cowardice but of humility, an understanding that to oppose domination effectively, one must resist the temptation to mirror it. And this resistance required a disposition grounded in patience rather than confidence. And it is significant that Manwë himself affirmed Olórin's suitability, declaring that it was precisely because he feared Sauron that he should go, for fear acknowledged honestly becomes caution, and caution preserves restraint, and in this exchange the philosophy underlying the Istari mission is laid bare, that victory over evil would not come through overwhelming force or authoritative decree, but through the strengthening of others, allowing elves and men to confront their own fate rather than submitting to salvation, imposed from beyond the world. And Olórin's acceptance of this mission, therefore, is not a moment of triumph, but of consent to limitation, a willingness to set aside the fullness of his nature in order to serve as a catalyst rather than a commander. And this consent defines the rest of his existence in Middle-earth, because from the moment he accepts, he binds himself to a path where success cannot be measured by conquest or control, but by endurance, influence, and the preservation of choice. And this path distinguishes him from others among the Istari, some of whom would later struggle with the constraints imposed upon them, seeking to accelerate outcomes through authority or order, while Olórin internalized the limits as essential to the mission itself, understanding that to exceed them would be to undermine the very purpose for which he was sent, and thus the choice of the Istari is not merely an administrative decision by the Valar, but a philosophical commitment to a particular vision of resistance, one that accepts uncertainty and risk as necessary costs of freedom, and within this vision Olórin's role is uniquely aligned, because his wisdom had always been shaped by the belief that lasting good cannot be imposed without loss, and that even the defeat of evil must leave the world capable of choosing its own future. And as he prepares to depart, leaving behind the clarity of the Undying Lands for the obscurity of Middle-earth, Olórin doesn't do so with certainty of success, but with resolve to remain faithful to restraint, carrying with him not the authority of a judge or the power of a warrior, but the quiet conviction that guidance offered freely, even when ignored, preserves the dignity of those it seeks to help. And this conviction becomes the unseen foundation of Gandalf's long labor, shaping a mission whose success would depend not on obedience but on trust, and whose greatest victories would be those in which his own influence faded into the background, leaving others to act in his stead. Chapter 3. The limits placed upon Gandalf were not accidental constraints imposed out of caution, but the central design of his mission, defining not only what he was permitted to do, but how resistance to evil was meant to function in an age no longer governed by direct divine intervention. And these limits operated on multiple levels: physical, spiritual, and moral, ensuring that Gandalf's presence in Middle-earth would strengthen rather than replace the agency of its peoples, because the Valar had learned through bitter experience that even well-intentioned power, when applied without restraint, reshapes the world in ways that diminish freedom and invite future corruption. And thus, Gandalf was sent not as a ruler or enforcer, but as a guide bound by humility, compelled to work through persuasion, example, and trust rather than command. And this design required him to accept vulnerability as a condition of effectiveness, taking the form of an old man subject to hunger, weariness, injury, and death, limitations that ensured his perspective remained grounded in the lived experience of those he sought to aid. And these physical constraints were mirrored by intellectual and moral boundaries, for Gandalf was forbidden from revealing his full nature or asserting authority through overt displays of power, because such revelations would shift responsibility away from elves and men, encouraging reliance rather than growth. And within this framework, Gandalf's wisdom was inseparable from restraint, as he learned to act decisively only when action would preserve choice rather than replace it. And this discipline is evident throughout his long watch, as he repeatedly chooses patience over intervention, allowing events to unfold even when outcomes remain uncertain, trusting that the moral development of free peoples cannot be accelerated without cost. And this trust differentiates him from others who sought more immediate solutions, because Gandalf understood that power, exercised prematurely, often creates dependence, and dependence undermines resilience, and thus his refusal to dominate was not passivity, but a deliberate strategy rooted in respect for freedom. And these limits also shaped how Gandalf confronted evil directly, because while he was capable of great power, its use was reserved for moments when all other options had failed, and even then it was employed not to impose lasting order, but to remove immediate obstacles that threatened to extinguish hope entirely. And this selective use of force reveals the precision of the design, because Gandalf was not meant to prevent all suffering or danger, but to ensure that suffering did not become absolute, and danger did not eliminate the possibility of choice. And this distinction is crucial because it explains why Gandalf often appears hesitant or indirect, particularly when compared to figures who pursue clarity through control, as his role was not to guarantee victory, but to preserve the conditions under which victory remained possible. And the weight of this responsibility required constant self-awareness, as Gandalf had to monitor not only the actions of others, but his own intentions, guarding against pride, impatience, and the subtle desire to be obeyed. And this internal vigilance was itself a form of labor, demanding humility as an ongoing practice rather than a single decision. And in this sense, the limits placed upon Gandalf were not external restraints alone, but invitations to cultivate wisdom through self-denial, reinforcing the principle that leadership rooted in restraint exerts influence more enduring than authority enforced through fear. And by accepting these limits fully, Gandalf aligned his mission with the deepest structure of Tolkien's moral universe, where freedom is preserved not by eliminating risk, but by ensuring that even in the presence of darkness, the capacity to choose remains intact. And thus, the design of Gandalf's limitations becomes inseparable from his eventual success, because it prevents him from becoming what he opposes, ensuring that the struggle against domination does not reproduce domination in another form. And, as the Third Age unfolds, these limits will repeatedly test Gandalf's resolve, forcing him to act without certainty of outcome, and to accept failure as a possible cost of fidelity to his purpose. Yet it is precisely this acceptance that distinguishes wisdom from power, establishing Gandalf not as a figure who controls history, but as one who safeguards the moral space within which history can still be freely made. Chapter 4. Gandalf's identity as the Grey Pilgrim is not defined by a fixed dwelling, a seat of authority, or a visible domain, but by movement itself. for from the moment he enters Middle-earth, his purpose is inseparable from wandering, listening, and observing, and this deliberate refusal to settle is central to understanding how his wisdom operates in practice, because by remaining in motion he resists the formation of power structures that might bind him to allegiance, expectation, or control, allowing him instead to move freely among peoples, cultures, and conflicts without becoming captive to any single perspective. And this mobility grants him access not only to information, but to experience, as he comes to understand Middle-earth, not as an abstract struggle between good and evil, but as a living network of fears, hopes, traditions, and misunderstandings that cannot be addressed through universal solutions. And through his journeys, Gandalf cultivates a form of knowledge that differs fundamentally from mastery, because it is shaped by encounter rather than command, by attention rather than instruction. And this distinction explains why he often appears more concerned with listening than speaking, allowing others to reveal their priorities and vulnerabilities before offering guidance. And this approach is evident in the trust he builds across races and realms, as he becomes a familiar presence not through authority, but through reliability, appearing when counsel is needed and departing before dependency can form. And the title of Grey Pilgrim reflects this balance, for grey signifies neither dominance nor purity, but humility, adaptability, and the blending of perspectives, qualities that allow Gandalf to mediate between extremes without imposing resolution. And this mediation is not neutral in the sense of indifference, but principled in its restraint, as Gandalf consistently aligns himself with the preservation of choice rather than the enforcement of outcomes, and his travels expose him to the smallest and most overlooked communities, particularly the hobbits, whose resilience, simplicity, and resistance to domination reinforce his conviction that greatness need not manifest through power. And it is through these relationships that Gandalf's wandering acquires deeper purpose, because he recognizes that the fate of Middle-earth will not be decided solely by kings or warriors, but by those who retain the capacity for mercy, patience, and courage unshaped by ambition. And this recognition further distances him from models of leadership based on control, as he comes to value influence that operates invisibly, strengthening resolve without claiming credit. And throughout his long journeys, Gandalf remains vigilant against the temptation to intervene prematurely, understanding that constant presence can become a form of dominance, subtly shaping decisions in ways that undermine autonomy. And thus his departures are as significant as his arrivals, because they preserve the independence of those he advises, ensuring that guidance does not harden into reliance. And this rhythm of approach and withdrawal defines Gandalf's role as the Grey Pilgrim, positioning him not as a central actor in history, but as a facilitator of possibility, creating conditions in which others may act freely and responsibly. And this role requires acceptance of misunderstanding, for Gandalf is often perceived as meddlesome, unreliable, or obscure, a perception he tolerates because clarity achieved through authority would compromise the mission's intent, and by embracing obscurity he preserves the freedom of those he aids, allowing them to accept or reject his counsel without coercion. And in this way Gandalf's wandering becomes an ethical practice rather than a logistical necessity, embodying the belief that wisdom must move lightly through the world, leaving few traces and claiming no ownership over outcomes. And as the Grey Pilgrim, he demonstrates that enduring influence is not built through permanence or control, but through attentiveness, restraint, and the willingness to remain unsettled, trusting that a world shaped by free choice, however fragile, is worth more than one secured through imposed order. Chapter 5. Gandalf's enduring alliance with the small and overlooked peoples of Middle-earth is not a sentimental preference, but a deliberate expression of his understanding of power, because throughout his long watch, he recognizes that those least drawn to domination are often those most capable of resisting it. And this recognition shapes his attention toward communities whose ambitions remain limited, whose lives are grounded in continuity rather than conquest, and whose moral choices are not complicated by the pursuit of authority. And among these peoples the hobbits stand foremost, not because they are destined for greatness, but because they are largely indifferent to it, and Gandalf's relationship with them develops over centuries through familiarity rather than intervention, as he becomes a presence woven quietly into their history, encouraging curiosity, resilience, and moral courage without demanding transformation. And this long association reveals Gandalf's belief that the preservation of ordinary life is itself a form of resistance, because a world in which simple joys, hospitality, and shared memory endure remains hostile to total domination, and Gandalf's affection for the Shire is therefore inseparable from his strategic insight, as he understands that evil thrives where fear, ambition, and despair have hollowed out daily life, while it falters in places where contentment resists manipulation. And this insight explains why Gandalf invests trust in individuals who possess little conventional power, because he values integrity over capability, and steadiness over brilliance, and this valuation becomes decisive when the fate of the world comes to rest upon choices made by those who neither seek nor desire authority. And Gandalf's guidance of hobbits is marked by restraint, as he resists the temptation to shield them entirely from danger, understanding that growth requires exposure to risk, yet he intervenes when annihilation would erase the possibility of choice altogether, maintaining the delicate balance between protection and independence that defines his broader mission. And this balance is mirrored in his relationships with other marginalized figures across Middle-earth, as he consistently extends attention to those ignored by rulers and councils, recognizing that insight often arises from perspectives unshaped by political calculation. And through these relationships, Gandalf cultivates a network of trust grounded not in command, but in mutual recognition, allowing information, aid, and resolve to circulate without centralization. And this decentralized structure contrasts sharply with the hierarchies favored by his enemies, reinforcing the theme that resilience emerges from dispersion rather than concentration. And Gandalf's reliance on the small and overlooked also reveals his acceptance of uncertainty, because placing faith in those without power means relinquishing control over outcomes, trusting that clarity will emerge not through design, but through choice. And this trust is repeatedly tested, yet Gandalf remains steadfast, because he understands that even failure born freely preserves dignity in a way that success imposed never can. And this conviction underscores why he never seeks to elevate hobbits into symbols or tools, allowing them to remain themselves even as they are drawn into events beyond their understanding. And by preserving their ordinariness, Gandalf safeguards the very qualities that make their resistance effective, ensuring that courage arises not from destiny, but from loyalty, compassion, and the refusal to abandon one another. And in this way, his friendship with the small and overlooked becomes one of the most profound expressions of his wisdom, demonstrating that the preservation of freedom depends not on the strength of rulers, but on the quiet endurance of those who choose goodness without expectation of reward, shaping the course of history not through command, but through the simple, resolute act of remaining humane in a world increasingly tempted by control. Chapter 6. Gandalf's relationship with power is defined not by its absence, but by a persistent and deliberate refusal to claim it. For throughout his long presence in Middle-earth, he is repeatedly offered opportunities to assert authority, command allegiance, or impose solutions. Yet he consistently declines these paths, not out of inability but out of understanding, because he recognizes that power, even when wielded with good intention, reshapes both the wielder and those subjected to it, narrowing the moral space in which free choice can exist. And this recognition is rooted in his origins as Olórin, where he learned that domination corrodes compassion, and that order imposed without consent ultimately mirrors the tyranny it seeks to oppose. and thus Gandalf's actions are guided by a constant evaluation of whether intervention would preserve agency or replace it, leading him to operate as an advisor rather than a ruler, even when his wisdom surpasses that of kings, and this posture is evident in his interactions with the leaders of men and elves, where he offers counsel that can be accepted or ignored without consequence, resisting the temptation to compel obedience through revelation of his true nature or superior knowledge, and his refusal to assume formal leadership positions is not a withdrawal from responsibility, but an acceptance of a different kind of burden, one that requires patience, trust, and the willingness to see plans fail without reclaiming control. And this willingness distinguishes him sharply from figures who equate authority with effectiveness, because Gandalf understands that lasting resistance to evil depends on the internalization of values rather than compliance enforced from above. And this understanding informs his restraint even in moments of crisis, as he often chooses to delay action until others are prepared to act for themselves, accepting the risk that such preparation may come too late. And this acceptance reveals a profound faith in the moral capacity of free peoples, a faith that does not deny their weaknesses, but affirms their potential for growth through choice. And Gandalf's limited use of power, when it does occur, is characterized by precision and transience, aimed at removing immediate threats rather than establishing enduring control, ensuring that his influence fades once danger passes, and this fading is essential because it prevents gratitude from becoming dependency and authority from becoming entitlement, and throughout his long struggle against Sauron, Gandalf remains acutely aware that victory, achieved through domination, would hollow out the very world it seeks to save, replacing one form of tyranny with another more benevolent in appearance but equally corrosive in effect. And this awareness underpins his refusal of objects and roles that would grant him supremacy, as he understands that the temptation to use power for good is among the most dangerous forms of corruption, precisely because it cloaks coercion in righteousness, and by consistently choosing influence over authority, Gandalf embodies a form of leadership that operates through trust, example, and shared responsibility, demonstrating that power need not be centralized to be effective, and that restraint, when grounded in wisdom, can shape events more enduringly than command. And in this way, Gandalf's relationship with power becomes one of disciplined distance rather than rejection, acknowledging its necessity in moments of last resort, while resisting its normalization as a tool of governance, preserving a vision of Middle-earth in which freedom is not safeguarded by the strength of rulers, but by the collective capacity of its peoples to choose courage, mercy, and cooperation without compulsion, a vision that defines not only Gandalf's mission, but the moral architecture of Tolkien's world itself. Chapter 7. Gandalf's approach to leadership is defined by his understanding that fear, rather than disobedience, is the true enemy of free peoples, and this insight shapes how he engages with individuals and communities facing the advance of darkness, because instead of demanding loyalty or enforcing unity, he focuses on confronting fear directly, exposing it, naming it, and helping others endure it without surrendering their capacity to choose. And this method reflects his belief that obedience achieved through authority offers only temporary stability, while courage cultivated through understanding endures beyond any single crisis. And throughout his long labor, Gandalf repeatedly places himself not above fear but within it, sharing the uncertainty of those he guides rather than shielding himself behind command, allowing trust to emerge organically from shared vulnerability. And this willingness to stand alongside others rather than above them distinguishes his influence from domination, as it preserves dignity even in moments of weakness, and Gandalf's words are therefore calibrated not to compel action, but to clarify stakes, illuminating consequences without prescribing outcomes, and this clarity enables individuals to act with ownership over their decisions, transforming participation into commitment rather than compliance, and his refusal to command obedience is especially evident in moments when fear threatens to paralyze entire communities, as he resists the temptation to impose order through force, choosing instead to remind others of what they already value, appealing to memory, loyalty, and responsibility rather than issuing decrees. And this approach accepts the risk that guidance may be ignored. Yet Gandalf accepts this risk as necessary, because choice that can be refused remains choice, while command erodes the moral agency it seeks to mobilize, and this philosophy is most powerful in its application to those who doubt themselves, as Gandalf recognizes that fear often arises not from external threat alone, but from uncertainty about one's own worth or capacity, and by affirming the significance of even the smallest contributions, he counters despair without inflating ego, reinforcing the idea that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. And this reinforcement creates resilience that does not depend on Gandalf's continued presence, allowing communities to sustain resistance independently once fear has been named and faced. And throughout these encounters, Gandalf remains attentive to the boundary between encouragement and manipulation, guarding against rhetoric that would substitute emotional momentum for understanding, because he understands that fear confronted through illusion merely transforms into dependence on the one who dispels it, and thus his guidance emphasizes reflection as much as resolve, encouraging others to see clearly rather than to act quickly, and in doing so, he demonstrates that leadership grounded in wisdom seeks not to eliminate fear, but to integrate it into conscious choice, allowing individuals and societies to move forward without surrendering autonomy. And this integration becomes a quiet but decisive force in the struggle against domination, because a people who understand their fear cannot be ruled by it, and a leader who refuses to command obedience preserves the moral space in which resistance remains authentic. And through this practice, Gandalf reveals that the most enduring victories are those in which authority dissolves at the moment action begins, leaving courage to stand on its own, unclaimed and uncoerced. Chapter 8. Gandalf's resistance to Sauron is defined not by direct confrontation, but by endurance, patience, and an unwavering commitment to vigilance across centuries. For unlike wars that flare and fade within a lifetime, the struggle against Sauron unfolds slowly, demanding a form of attention that resists both exhaustion and complacency. And this long watch becomes one of Gandalf's greatest burdens, because it requires acting without certainty of recognition or success, sustaining effort in the absence of visible progress, and accepting that meaningful resistance may consist largely of prevention rather than victory. And throughout this watch, Gandalf operates as a connective presence, gathering fragments of knowledge dispersed across lands and generations, listening to rumors, studying signs, and weighing silence as carefully as speech, because he understands that Sauron's greatest strength lies not only in force but in concealment, misdirection, and the exploitation of neglect, and this understanding shapes Gandalf's method as he prioritizes awareness over action, ensuring that threats are recognized before they can solidify into inevitability. And this vigilance is not passive, for it requires constant travel, dialogue, and memory, binding together histories that others allow to fade, and in doing so, Gandalf preserves continuity in a world increasingly prone to forgetfulness, recognizing that forgetting is itself a form of vulnerability, and this role places him in quiet contrast to figures who seek decisive solutions, because Gandalf accepts that some evils cannot be eradicated quickly without greater harm, and thus he resists the temptation to force resolution, choosing instead to delay, contain, and weaken Sauron's influence wherever possible, even when such efforts appear modest or inconclusive. And this restraint is grounded in his awareness that premature confrontation risks unifying evil under a single banner, accelerating its consolidation rather than dispersing it, and so Gandalf works to prevent alignment, to disrupt alliances before they fully coalesce, and to preserve fragmentation among hostile forces, understanding that division limits domination. And this strategic patience demands humility, because it often produces no visible acclaim, leaving Gandalf to labor in obscurity, while others receive recognition for victories made possible by his unseen groundwork. And yet, he accepts this obscurity willingly, because the long watch is sustained not by reward but by responsibility. And as centuries pass, Gandalf's vigilance becomes increasingly focused, guided by the recognition that Sauron's return will not announce itself openly, but will manifest through subtle shifts in power, ambition, and fear. And this recognition leads him to attend closely to places and peoples overlooked by great councils, understanding that the margins often reveal what the center ignores, and through this attentive presence, he ensures that resistance remains distributed rather than centralized, preventing Sauron from exploiting single points of failure. And this distribution is crucial because it preserves resilience even when leaders fall or plans unravel. And throughout this long watch, Gandalf must also guard against despair, for vigilance without resolution risks eroding hope, and thus he continually renews his commitment by investing in the moral strength of individuals, reinforcing the belief that endurance itself is meaningful even when outcomes remain uncertain. And this belief sustains him through long years of apparent stalemate, allowing him to persist without demanding closure, and by embracing the slow labor of watching rather than the spectacle of conquest, Gandalf exemplifies a form of resistance that values continuity over climax, preserving the conditions necessary for eventual choice and action, and in doing so, he ensures that when the moment of open confrontation finally arrives, Middle-earth will not face it unprepared or alone, but supported by a web of awareness, trust, and memory patiently maintained across generations, demonstrating that the most decisive struggles against domination are often won not in moments of battle, but in the quiet refusal to look away. Chapter 9. Gandalf's journey is marked not only by wisdom and endurance, but by failure accepted without resentment and sacrifice embraced without certainty of return. And it is in these moments that the true depth of his character is revealed, because unlike figures who measure success through preservation of self or authority, Gandalf understands that fidelity to purpose may demand loss that cannot be justified by immediate outcome, and this understanding culminates most clearly in his confrontation with the Balrog in Moria, an encounter that is not sought, planned, or framed as heroic destiny, but arises as the final consequence of commitment to others, as Gandalf remains behind not to win glory, but to prevent annihilation, fully aware that the cost may be his own life, and this willingness to fall so that others may pass reflects the purest expression of his restraint, because he does not sacrifice himself to impose victory, but to preserve choice, ensuring that those who continue are not bound by his authority but freed by his absence. And Tolkien presents this moment not as defeat transformed into triumph, but as loss endured in faith, as Gandalf does not know whether his sacrifice will succeed, only that failure to act would render all other efforts meaningless. And this acceptance of uncertainty distinguishes sacrifice from calculation, because it relinquishes control over consequences, trusting that meaning can persist even when outcomes remain unseen, and Gandalf's fall is therefore not an interruption of his mission, but its fulfillment in extremis, demonstrating that wisdom does not guarantee survival, and that guidance offered freely may ultimately demand payment without promise of return. And this moment reframes Gandalf's long resistance to power, because it reveals that restraint is not synonymous with safety, but often increases vulnerability, as those who refuse domination cannot shield themselves behind authority or command, and yet it is precisely this vulnerability that preserves moral integrity, preventing the struggle against evil from becoming a mirror of the evil opposed. And in the silence that follows Gandalf's fall, the narrative emphasizes the cost borne not only by him, but by those who must continue without his counsel, underscoring that sacrifice redistributes burden rather than eliminating it, forcing others to grow into responsibility rather than relying on protection. And this redistribution is central to Tolkien's moral vision, because it affirms that no single figure, however wise, should carry the fate of the world alone, and Gandalf's willingness to accept failure as a possible endpoint reinforces this principle, as he never assumes that his role is indispensable, trusting instead that the strength he has nurtured in others will endure beyond his presence. And in this way, his sacrifice becomes an act of confidence in Middle-earth itself, a belief that courage and responsibility can persist even when guidance is withdrawn, and when Gandalf passes through death. The narrative does not immediately offer resolution or reward, allowing the weight of loss to stand unsoftened, reminding the reader that sacrifice, even when necessary, remains a wound, not a transaction. And through this portrayal, Tolkien rejects any notion that wisdom insulates one from suffering, presenting Gandalf's fall as the culmination of a life lived in service without expectation of preservation. And in doing so, he affirms that true leadership is measured not by survival or command, but by the willingness to be spent in the defense of freedom, even when that defense demands the ultimate cost without assurance of renewal. Chapter 10. Gandalf's Return, as the White is not presented as resurrection in the heroic sense, nor as a reward for sacrifice, but as a restoration of purpose shaped by necessity, authority granted not to dominate but to correct imbalance. And this distinction is essential to understanding the transformation, because while Gandalf returns with greater clarity and strength, his role remains fundamentally constrained by the same principles that govern his mission as the Grey Pilgrim. And Tolkien emphasizes that this return occurs only after Gandalf has been tested beyond endurance, having given all that was permitted to him and more, not in power but in self-denial. And the title of the White signifies not supremacy but responsibility, marking him as the one now tasked with opposing misuse of authority rather than exercising it. And this shift is immediately evident in his confrontation with Saruman, where Gandalf's authority manifests not through violence but through the revocation of legitimacy, stripping Saruman of voice and standing rather than compelling obedience through force. And this act reveals the nature of Gandalf's enhanced power, because it operates by restoring moral order rather than imposing new structure, correcting deviation rather than asserting command. And even in this moment, Gandalf does not replace Saruman as ruler, refusing to claim Orthanc or any seat of governance, underscoring that authority, once granted, must still be declined if it threatens to concentrate power improperly. And as Gandalf the White, he becomes more decisive, yet not more controlling, acting with urgency when delay would enable domination, but withdrawing when action would displace the agency of others. And this balance reflects the refinement of his wisdom rather than its abandonment, as he now intervenes with clearer timing rather than greater force, understanding that leadership requires discernment of when restraint ceases to serve freedom, and when inaction would permit tyranny to consolidate. And throughout this phase, Gandalf's presence accelerates coordination among free peoples without subsuming them under his will, as he facilitates alignment rather than command, ensuring that decisions remain distributed among those who must bear their consequences. And this facilitative authority contrasts sharply with models of power that centralize control in the name of efficiency, because Gandalf recognizes that speed gained through domination undermines resilience, and thus his enhanced role is exercised primarily in moments of transition, stabilizing structures long enough for others to assume responsibility, and then receding once balance is restored. And even as Gandalf the White, he remains bound by humility, never presenting himself as the solution to Middle-earth's peril, but as one who removes obstacles so that others may act. And this restraint is critical, because it ensures that the struggle against Sauron does not become dependent on a single figure, preserving the moral architecture of freedom that underpins the entire resistance. And Tolkien reinforces this by depicting Gandalf's authority as situational rather than absolute, effective only insofar as it aligns with the shared purpose of resisting domination. And as the narrative progresses, Gandalf the White emerges not as a ruler ascendant, but as a steward of transition, guiding Middle-earth through its most perilous hour without claiming ownership over its fate, demonstrating that even restored power must remain provisional, accountable, and ultimately relinquished. And in this way, Gandalf's transformation affirms rather than contradicts his original mission, revealing that true authority, when exercised rightly, seeks its own disappearance once balance is restored, leaving behind not obedience, but the renewed capacity of free peoples to govern themselves without fear. Chapter 11. In the final phase of his labor in Middle-earth, Gandalf's authority becomes most visible precisely through his continued refusal to rule, as his role shifts toward coordination, counsel, and timing rather than command, revealing that the culmination of wisdom is not control, but trust in others to act rightly. And this trust defines his interactions with the realms of men during the War of the Ring, where despite possessing insight that surpasses that of kings and stewards, he consistently resists assuming permanent leadership, choosing instead to support existing structures without replacing them. And this restraint is especially evident in Gondor, where Gandalf offers guidance to the steward, not as a superior, but as a guardian of perspective, ensuring that despair does not eclipse responsibility, while leaving final decisions in mortal hands. And this dynamic underscores his belief that victory achieved through imposed authority would hollow out the very societies it seeks to protect, leaving them dependent rather than renewed. And in Rohan, Gandalf's intervention restores agency rather than appropriates it, as he acts to remove the influence that has paralyzed judgment, allowing rightful leadership to reassert itself without claiming credit or control. And these actions reveal a consistent pattern, because Gandalf intervenes only to the extent necessary to restore freedom of action, withdrawing once clarity and courage return. And this pattern extends to his role within councils, where his voice carries weight, not through coercion, but through earned trust, shaped by long consistency and visible sacrifice. And even when his counsel is urgent, he frames it as appeal rather than decree, recognizing that obedience compelled by authority dissolves once authority is absent, while commitment forged through understanding endures. And throughout these moments, Gandalf demonstrates that leadership rooted in wisdom does not seek permanence, but transition, guiding others through crisis so that governance may remain theirs, not his. And this orientation is crucial to the moral outcome of the war, because it ensures that the defeat of Sauron does not inaugurate a new age of centralized control under a benevolent overseer, but restores the possibility of self-rule, grounded in memory, cooperation, and shared burden. And Gandalf's acceptance of this limitation is itself a final act of humility, acknowledging that even victory does not entitle one to dominion, and that the task of the Istari was never to govern the world, but to help it govern itself. And as the war reaches its climax, Gandalf's presence becomes increasingly peripheral, not because he is less important, but because his work has succeeded in distributing responsibility among those who must carry the future forward. And this withdrawal marks the quiet fulfillment of his mission, as he steps back from the center of events, allowing the outcome to be shaped by choices freely made rather than guided by a single will. And through this final phase of guidance without rule, Tolkien affirms that the highest form of leadership is that which prepares its own absence, ensuring that when guidance fades, what remains is not dependence but resilience, and not obedience, but the renewed capacity of free peoples to choose their own path without fear or domination. Chapter 12. The contrast between wisdom and knowledge reaches its clearest expression in the divergence between Gandalf and Saruman, revealing that the failure of one and the endurance of the other arise not from difference in intellect or ability, but from fundamentally opposing relationships to understanding itself, because while both possessed vast learning, memory of ancient lore, and insight into the workings of power, Gandalf treats knowledge as a tool subordinate to moral judgment, whereas Saruman comes to regard it as an end in itself, and this distinction proves decisive, for Gandalf's wisdom is characterized by humility, an awareness of what he does not know, and a willingness to revise his assumptions in response to lived experience, while Saruman's knowledge hardens into certainty, encouraging him to believe that comprehension confers entitlement, and that mastery of information justifies mastery of others, and Tolkien presents this divergence not as an abrupt corruption, but as a gradual reorientation, where Saruman's pursuit of understanding becomes increasingly detached from compassion, turning curiosity into control and analysis into domination, and Gandalf, by contrast, consistently resists the illusion that knowledge grants moral authority, remaining attentive to context, consequence, and the limits of foresight, and this attentiveness allows him to recognize that information alone cannot resolve moral conflict, because decisions must account for human weakness, fear, and the unpredictability of free will. And throughout their parallel paths, Gandalf demonstrates that wisdom is not the accumulation of facts, but the disciplined integration of knowledge with restraint, memory with humility, and foresight with acceptance of uncertainty. And this integration enables him to act decisively without claiming infallibility, preserving openness to counsel and correction, even when circumstances demand urgency, and the consequences of these differing orientations become increasingly visible as Saruman's knowledge isolates him, narrowing his perspective until he interprets dissent as ignorance and resistance as inefficiency, while Gandalf's wisdom expands his network of trust, drawing strength from collaboration rather than control. And Tolkien emphasizes that Saruman's fall is not caused by ignorance of evil, but by overconfidence in his ability to manage it, a belief that he can harness power without being reshaped by it, whereas Gandalf's success lies in his refusal to assume such mastery, recognizing that proximity to domination inevitably alters intention, and this refusal preserves his moral clarity, allowing him to see when action must give way to patience and when patience must yield to sacrifice. And in this contrast, the narrative articulates one of its most enduring lessons, that knowledge without wisdom accelerates corruption, because it tempts the mind to bypass ethical limits in pursuit of efficiency, while wisdom without domination sustains freedom, because it acknowledges that understanding does not eliminate responsibility. And as Gandalf continues to guide rather than rule, his example demonstrates that the most dangerous misconception is not ignorance, but the belief that one knows enough to decide for others. And through this distinction, Tolkien affirms that true wisdom remains inseparable from humility, because only those who accept the limits of their understanding can resist the temptation to reshape the world according to a single will, ensuring that knowledge serves life rather than subjugating it. And it is this disciplined relationship to understanding that allows Gandalf to endure where Saruman collapses, preserving not only insight but the moral capacity to use it without surrendering to the desire for control. Chapter 13. During the War of the Ring, Gandalf's wisdom reaches its most exacting test, not because the conflict demands greater power, but because it requires unwavering commitment to restraint amid overwhelming pressure, as the fate of Middle-earth narrows toward moments where decisive action tempts the consolidation of authority. And yet, Gandalf continues to resist becoming the central force upon which victory depends, understanding that such dependence would transform liberation, into another form of domination, and throughout the war his role is defined by coordination rather than command, ensuring that each realm confronts its own responsibility rather than surrendering it to a singular will, and this approach shapes the structure of resistance itself as Gandalf works to align efforts without subsuming them, preserving diversity of leadership and perspective even when unity is essential, and this balance is evident in how he moves between fronts, offering counsel where despair threatens to paralyze and withdrawing where courage has taken root, trusting that the moral strength of others will endure without constant supervision. And Gandalf's refusal to seize control becomes especially significant as the temptation of expedience grows, because the war presents countless opportunities to justify authoritarian measures in the name of survival. Yet Gandalf consistently chooses the slower, riskier path of shared decision-making, accepting that coordination through consent is less efficient but more resilient, and this acceptance underscores his belief that victory achieved through coercion would poison the peace that follows, leaving societies conditioned to obedience rather than cooperation, and thus his interventions are calibrated to preserve initiative among leaders and warriors alike, reinforcing their capacity to act independently once guidance recedes. And this distributed responsibility proves crucial because it prevents the collapse of resistance when any single leader falters, ensuring that the struggle does not hinge on Gandalf's presence alone. And throughout the war, Gandalf also remains acutely aware of the conflict's asymmetry, recognizing that the true contest is not between armies, but between domination and freedom. And this awareness informs his prioritization of the ring-bearer's mission over visible victories, as he understands that military success without moral resolution would merely delay defeat, and by refusing to center himself as a commander, Gandalf preserves the moral architecture necessary for the war's true objective, the destruction of power rather than its transfer, and this preservation requires patience even in moments of apparent futility, as Gandalf commits resources to actions whose success cannot be guaranteed, trusting that faith placed in free choice carries its own strength, and this trust extends to individuals whose contributions remain invisible to the larger narrative of war, affirming that significance is not determined by rank or recognition. And as the conflict reaches its climax, Gandalf's presence becomes increasingly symbolic rather than directive, embodying continuity, memory, and resolve without dictating outcome. And this symbolic role reinforces the principle that the war is not won by superior command, but by the collective endurance of free peoples acting without compulsion. And when victory finally comes, it does so without elevating Gandalf to rulership or acclaim, allowing him to remain what he has always been, a guide whose success lies in having made himself unnecessary at the moment of triumph, ensuring that the end of the war does not inaugurate a new age of oversight, but restores the possibility of self-determination grounded in shared responsibility. And through this portrayal, the War of the Ring becomes not only a military conflict, but a moral proving ground, where Gandalf's wisdom without power demonstrates that freedom can prevail precisely because it refuses to be centralized even under the gravest threat. Chapter 14. Gandalf's refusal of the ring stands as the clearest articulation of his understanding of power and its costs, because it is not rooted in doubt about his ability to wield it, but in certainty about what such wielding would require him to become, and this certainty distinguishes his wisdom from mere caution, for he recognizes that the ring does not simply amplify intention, but reshapes it, binding even the desire to do good to the logic of domination. And Gandalf's awareness of this danger is grounded in his knowledge of himself, as he understands that his compassion, patience, and concern for others would not protect him from corruption, but rather render him uniquely vulnerable to the ring's promise, because it would offer him the means to enforce order, prevent suffering, and eliminate uncertainty, all aims aligned with his deepest values, yet achievable only through the erosion of freedom, and this recognition reveals the subtlety of the ring's threat as it does not entice through cruelty alone, but through the temptation to resolve moral complexity by replacing choice with control. And Gandalf's refusal therefore represents an act of self-knowledge rather than heroism, an acknowledgement that even wisdom, when armed with absolute power, becomes tyranny in another guise. And Tolkien emphasizes that Gandalf's vision of himself as a ring-bearer is not of open malice, but of benevolent despotism, a ruler who would seek to do good relentlessly, correcting error, suppressing dissent, and reshaping the world according to a single, well-intentioned design. And this vision terrifies him precisely because it would feel justified at every step, eliminating the internal resistance that guards against corruption. And by refusing the ring, Gandalf affirms that moral authority cannot coexist with absolute power, because the latter demands outcomes while the former preserves process. And this refusal also reinforces his trust in others as he accepts that the burden must be borne by those less inclined to command, whose resistance to domination arises not from wisdom alone, but from simplicity, attachment to ordinary life, and reluctance to rule. And in entrusting the fate of the world to such hands, Gandalf embraces uncertainty as a necessary condition of freedom, rejecting the illusion that catastrophe can be averted through centralized control. And this rejection underscores the philosophical core of Tolkien's work, that the desire to eliminate risk through power often creates greater peril because it substitutes domination for responsibility. And Gandalf's refusal thus becomes an act of preservation, not only for Middle-earth, but for himself, ensuring that his role remains aligned with guidance rather than governance, and that his influence continues to operate through encouragement rather than enforcement. And in this moment, the distinction between wisdom and power is rendered absolute, as Gandalf chooses limitation over certainty, trust over control, and vulnerability over dominion, demonstrating that the greatest safeguard against corruption is not strength of will alone, but the humility to recognize that some power must never be exercised, no matter how compelling its promise, because its cost would be the very freedom that gives moral action meaning. Chapter 15, Gandalf's departure from Middle-earth, is not framed as a retreat from relevance, but as the final fulfillment of a mission defined by self-limitation, because his work was never intended to culminate in permanence, authority, or remembrance, but in the restoration of a world capable of continuing without him. And this distinction shapes the meaning of his legacy. For unlike rulers whose influence persists through institutions or monuments, Gandalf leaves behind something less visible yet more enduring, the capacity of free peoples to choose courage without supervision. And as the Fourth Age begins, his presence fades, not because he has failed or been superseded, but because his success requires withdrawal, ensuring that the age of men unfolds without guardianship from powers beyond the world. And this withdrawal reflects the same restraint that governed his every action, reinforcing the principle that guidance, once internalized, must be relinquished lest it become control. And Gandalf's farewell is therefore marked by quiet continuity rather than rupture, as friendships endure without dependence and memories persist without reverence that would distort their meaning. And this balance preserves dignity on both sides, honoring what was given without transforming it into obligation. And Tolkien emphasizes that Gandalf does not linger to oversee outcomes or correct errors, accepting that the world he leaves will make mistakes, suffer losses, and face challenges without recourse to his counsel, because freedom without risk would be an illusion, and this acceptance reveals the depth of his trust in Middle-earth itself, a belief that moral growth does not end with victory, but begins anew once protection is withdrawn. And Gandalf's legacy thus resides not in laws or commands, but in dispositions, patience learned through endurance, courage discovered through fear confronted, and humility preserved through restraint. And these dispositions manifest quietly in the lives of those he guided, shaping decisions without announcing their source, ensuring that influence remains diffuse rather than centralized. And this diffusion is essential because it prevents the crystallization of authority around memory of the past, allowing the future to remain open rather than governed by precedent. And in this way, Gandalf's departure mirrors his arrival, unobtrusive, deliberate, and necessary, closing a cycle defined not by conquest but by stewardship. And as he leaves the shores of Middle-earth, the narrative affirms that wisdom without power is not a lesser form of strength, but its refinement, capable of shaping history precisely because it refuses to own it. And through Gandalf's absence, the world is returned to itself, unguarded yet not abandoned, bearing within it the imprint of guidance that no longer commands attention but continues to inform choice, and this imprint constitutes his true legacy, a quiet inheritance of responsibility, entrusted to those who must now live without certainty of rescue, carrying forward the understanding that freedom, once preserved, must be maintained not by overseers, but by the daily, imperfect decisions of ordinary lives. And in this enduring uncertainty lies the final affirmation of Gandalf's wisdom, that a world worth saving is one that must be allowed to stand on its own, unruled, unprotected, and free to choose its path beyond the reach of even the wisest guide.